Well, howdy, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to American History Class, live from my house. 2 weeks left, coming down to the stretch run, and then summer vacation shall begin. And not that you can go anywhere, but anyway. So when we last left off, we were talking about the election of Richard Nixon, which happened in 1968. You have a fairly divided Democratic Party over issues like Vietnam. Ultimately, after the peace candidate Eugene McCarthy makes a splash, then Robert Kennedy gets in the race, but he winds up getting assassinated. Right around the same time, you also have the assassination of Dr. King. The 60s was a period of time where there was an awful lot of political violence, and so from there, with Kennedy out of the race with his death, the nomination swings to Hubert Humphrey, who was on the more moderate side of things, pro-Vietnam. This caused protest in the streets. And then on top of that, George Wallace, who was the Democratic governor of Alabama, ran as a third-party candidate on a very pro-segregation platform, which swung several southern states to Wallace. He's actually the last third party to win electoral votes, to actually win states. He won 5 states in the Deep South. And so with the Democratic division, Richard Nixon waltzes to the presidency fairly easily in terms of the Electoral College. The popular vote totals are actually fairly close. I want to say it was 47 to 42 or something like that. It wasn't an incredible beatdown in the popular vote, but the way the electoral vote played out, Humphrey really didn't win all that much except a few states in the Northeast. And 68 is kind of a turning point in electoral politics at the presidential level, because it's the first time the Democrats literally did not win a single state in the South. Now, up until this time, if you remember, the Democrats were the dominant party in the South. They called it the Solid South because it was solidly Democratic, and the Democrats knew they could always count on the South. There was a slight movement away from the Democrats that began in the northern South, like Virginia and North Carolina, back in the 50s, here and there. Some of them got into Eisenhower and so on. But Nixon is the one who really runs with the strategy of trying to win Southerners that were getting offended by the pace of social change. It's a bit of a myth to say that the South abandoned the Democratic Party over desegregation entirely. That's kind of the way people try to spin it. That was a factor, but it's also true that southern states are still sending majority Democratic congressional delegations all the way until the early 90s, until 1994, when the Republicans swept the House. So it really was a slow process, and it didn't happen overnight in reaction to integration, like some people say. But the reality is, though, that that was a major factor in kind of causing political realignment. So Nixon, wins the presidency, and his, I think it was his inaugural speech. If it wasn't his inaugural speech, it was one of his first major speeches as president. He talked about, he made a speech that represented himself as the voice of, quote unquote, the silent majority. And the idea is that, the vast majority of Americans, and he might have even implied the vast majority of the real Americans, and I always hate it when people use rhetoric like that, because, everyone who's in America is by definition a real American, but nonetheless, he would kind of, the idea behind the silent majority speech is, most of the real Americans don't believe in all this social change and rioting in the streets and hippies in their long hair, and and of course, unfortunately, the whole civil rights thing was kind of, he wasn't explicitly saying, we don't like integration, because in fact, as we'll see, he actually was kind of a moderate on civil rights and sympathetic with it to a certain extent, but he certainly, there's an extent to which he leaned on some of the resentment toward it as a campaign thing. And so one of the interesting things about Nixon is who people think Nixon is and who Nixon actually is in the White House are two very different animals. because Nixon, he makes his reputation in politics in the 1950s as the chairman of the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, which was, of course, one of the primary congressional committee carrying on the investigation of communist influence, and was kind of the precursor to McCarthyism in some ways, although Nixon's committee was a little more responsible than McCarthy's. There still was, a lot of liberal critics say that, they were, behind a lot of blacklisting of leftists and so on. So he has this reputation as this ardent anti-communist, and then, as we'll see, Nixon's signature foreign policy accomplishments are actually, making relative peace with the world's communist governments. And then, he partly exploits, civil rights resentment in running, but then actually, for the most part, works toward further integration when he's president. We'll talk about one little deal about that in a second. So there's and typically Nixon is kind of was presented in the press as this like arch conservative in terms of how he was at times presented, but in reality his economic policies were actually very liberal. I would say Richard Nixon as president was probably more liberal on economics than Bill Clinton was. So he's kind of a contradiction in terms. A lot of people think they know who Richard Nixon is, and their facts are a little funky. We'll talk in the next video about the controversies concerning all the scandal that raged during the Nixon years, but we'll focus more on the policy side of things today. So when Nixon comes in, I mentioned there was one civil rights controversy that he did kind of stand against kind of the mainstream of the civil rights movement, although he probably was siding with popular opinion on it. And so that is the issue of forced busing. So what that was about was, Brown versus Board of Education officially desegregated the school system in 1954. But because a lot of times, people tend to live in neighborhoods that often have fairly similar ethnic makeup, there's a lot of the schools that just, they were hypothetically integrated, but they hadn't actually done it, or because there were either no white students or no black students to go to the area, or people were kept in the schools that they had been enrolled in at the beginning, even if, and so as a result, you really had far less actual integration of the classroom than you would have expected between 54 and 68. Excuse me. Thought I had to sneeze, but so at some point, a federal court actually orders a school district saying that they weren't doing enough to follow the edict in Brown versus Board. Actually orders them to start kind of busing kids like across town, kind of across the tracks, because a lot of back in segregation days, we kind of used to say, we kind of used the phrase going across the tracks to mean the other side of town, but like that actually was kind of the way a lot of towns were set up in those days. Was like there would be like, you oftentimes had a white part of town on one side of the train tracks and a black part of town on the other one, and that's what a lot of these towns look like. And they actually said, let's make people, make the school buses take them across town to other schools so that we can start to, to mix together more. So then you had, so you obviously had your pro-busing side that says, yeah, this is the solution that's going to actually, make the schools more integrated, because they were saying, as long as they were kind of accidentally segregated, it was still really easy to, put more budget toward one school than the other, and so on. And so you had a crowd that was in favor, but then you had two groups that were opposed to busing. One, first off, obviously, if you already didn't like civil rights, you already didn't like integration, you already thought that everyone needed to be separate, then you're obviously not going to like busing. So you have a group of people that are anti-integration in the first place, and they continue that stance with busing. But then you have a second group of people who either hadn't made civil rights a main focus, or who were sympathetic to it and favored the Brown versus Board decision and favored increasing rights for African Americans, but didn't think that it was smart to forcibly bus kids across town to the bad part of town. And you think about it, I mean, if you were a parent at that time, and the judge is telling you, your kid has to go, an hour across town to go to another school, and you've got one that's closer to you, and all this is being done to facilitate some sort of social goal. I mean, you could understand why a lot of people were skeptical about this whole thing, and so there was a big outcry against it, and it caused some riots, not just in the South but in the North. There was famously a riot surrounding this issue in Boston, Massachusetts. And so there's a lot of, and so one thing about busing is that busing actually causes kind of some racial strife to spread to a lot of the northern and midwestern cities as well. And when George Wallace is starting to run for president yet another time in 1972, before he gets shot and has to end his campaign, he was starting to pull some support in a lot of the places like Illinois and Wisconsin and people, places like that out in the northern Midwest. He was starting to get some sympathy that he didn't get when he was running the first time in '68. So, so Nixon officially opposes forced busing, tries his best to slow down enforcement. The courts kind of insist on it, so it continues during his presidency, but without his administration's support. So because of that, a lot of people, will want to say that Nixon was kind of, anti-civil rights, but that's not really true. He was anti the busing thing because he just thought that was too much, and then also there was political reasons for that as well. But in other areas, he actually did some things for civil rights. And so if you actually look at the record of when Nixon came into office in '68, I think it was just about 2/3 of black kids in the South attended all black schools. By the time his first term ended in '72, then the number had gone down to less than 10%. So in reality, and a lot of that was because Nixon started bringing Justice Department civil rights violation cases against schools that wouldn't integrate. So the reality is he actually did good work on integrating the schools. He just didn't like the busing thing for reasons that I think are understandable. So moving to kind of economic issues, you started to have some economic problems during Nixon's term, and some of this was connected to just the increased amount of spending. Lyndon Johnson was trying to spend a lot of money on both the Great Society and the Vietnam War without raising taxes, and so the result of that was you started to run big deficits that started to cause inflation, which is... We'll look more about all the whys and wherefores next year in economics, but when you have too much of a budget deficit, it's going to cause inflation at times. So ultimately, one of the things that Nixon tries to do, they raise some interest rates, they try to cut the federal budget and try to cut spending a little bit, and a handful of other things, but ultimately he winds up having to make some more radical steps. One thing that he does is Nixon actually takes the country off of the gold standard permanently. Up until Nixon, America we'd kind of gone back and forth with the gold standard, but as of when he took office, the idea was, every dollar bill is backed by gold sitting in a federal treasury somewhere, and Nixon got rid of that. Nowadays, the money is only good because the government says it is, and it can't be exchanged, one for one, $1 of gold bar for $1, the same way that it once could have. So that was one thing, but he actually adopts, in an attempt to prevent inflation, different things, he actually adopts something called the New Economic Policy, which ironically shares its name with an economic strategy that Lenin had tried in the Soviet Union. Now, they weren't the same thing. The New Economic Policy of Lenin was actually a step toward capitalism, and they kind of had to backtrack from pure communism for a couple years in order to salvage the economy to continue their communist experiment in the future. But the NEP was definitely it was definitely pretty statist, a real conservative, like a Reaganite would probably, pull his hair out thinking of the NEP. And so the NEP, one of the things that it did was it actually installed a ceiling and floor on wages and prices. So wage controls and price controls, where for a certain period of I think it was maybe 90 days or whatever, in an attempt to prevent an economic emergency in his mind. They actually made it a law that you couldn't pay more than a certain amount or less than, so they started to actually regulate people's pay and the prices of certain goods, made it illegal to raise the prices on them. And the idea behind this was for it to help get a handle on inflation. Of course, wage and price controls almost always backfire, and they did backfire in meaningful ways. Come 1973, he kind of abolished those guidelines as mandates and kind of kept them around as voluntary things. So Nixon, again, not a very conservative economic policy to be imposing wage and price controls. While Nixon is president, some of this passed over his veto. Some of this had his support, but the Nixon presidency is also the time period where the government starts to get more involved in pollution regulation. The Clean Air and Water Act of I think it was 71 or 72 passes, I think possibly over his veto. But ultimately, I can't remember if it's under Nixon or Carter that the EPA is finally officially established, which manages kind of our environmental policy. And the EPA has in recent years just gotten into all kinds of stupidity and gone well beyond what it needed to do on various things. But there probably was a pretty good reason for why it started. And one of the things that actually inspired it was when a river in Ohio that was near a chemical plant actually caught on fire, which rivers are not supposed to catch on fire, but there were so many chemicals in the water that were flammable that you actually had you could go on YouTube and find images of the river with flames on top going floating along. So I understand probably why you would have been in favor of passing some laws trying to cut down on pollution. So this is kind of the beginning of environmental policy as a thing is during this time period. Where Nixon is probably most famous outside of the scandals, which we'll talk about tomorrow, is in foreign policy. Because Nixon, first off, he's going to end the Vietnam War, and then he's going to move us into a new position with the Soviet Union that is known as a détente, which is a French word meaning cooling or thawing. And the idea was that there was a thawing in the Cold War. And the détente presidents are going to be Nixon, Gerald Ford, his vice president who becomes president, not his original vice president, and then Jimmy Carter. So those three presidents are going to be the presidents of the détente era, and that is an era where we have an improved relationship with the Soviet Union and a little bit less of a constant threat of nuclear Armageddon. Nonetheless, there's reasons to be critical of some of the decisions that the détente presidents made. Once we got through the whole thing without having had nuclear war, you kind of don't want to go back and mess with the timeline, so I won't criticize them too much. Some things were good achievements and some were bad. The most famous achievement that Nixon did was establishing a diplomatic relationship with communist China. China at the time was under the leadership of Mao Zedong, one of the worst mass murderers in history. But the reason that we wanted to establish a relationship with China was because China and the Soviet Union, who had been allies as of 1950, had actually become enemies by 1970, because China kind of felt like they ought to be the leader of the communist world, and the Soviet Union took for granted that they ought to be the leader of the communist world. And so their interests began to clash. And once they broke off some of their formal alliance, they're actually, because the USSR and China held the largest border in the world, there were actually a couple border clashes where Russian and Chinese soldiers actually shot at each other. It never escalated into full-scale war or invasion of the country, but there was a few skirmishes. So we thought, wouldn't it be great if we could, because we were trying to prepare the way towards doing some negotiating for something that would become known as the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or the SALT Treaty, which were gonna put a cap. Us and the Soviet Union, the idea was to get us to agree to a cap of how many missiles that we would have, because by then, both countries had stocked up enough of a stockpile to blow up the world a few times over if we really wanted to. So, we just thought it wasn't safe to have this many weapons sitting around. And so so we're headed toward these SALT talks, and the idea was, wouldn't it be great if we had the leverage of Chinese support in some of these treaties we're trying to negotiate? And so we wanted to open up, and this leads to us slowly but surely opening China up to trade. Now, it's difficult to overstate how important this is, because without Nixon going to China, you don't have the things slowly opening up to Chinese trade throughout the late 70s, 80s, and then exploding trade with China in the 90s and early 2000s, to where, now a tremendous number of things that you're wearing, or any number of things that you have around your house would say made in China. And so, and of course, now that China is emerging as a more hostile superpower and kind of trying to make a play for being the dominant, country in the world, despite having, one of the worst humanitarian records in the world, maybe you look back at Nixon and say, yeah, maybe you shouldn't have done this. Because there's no doubt that what Nixon does, while it may have served our purposes in the short run, does set up the growing influence of the Chinese government, and has to represent at least a partial betrayal of Taiwan, who had been our ally up until this point. Nixon does not officially de-recognize Taiwan, but Carter is going to, and so so that's going to really bring a chilling effect on U.S.-Taiwanese relations. So. Nixon's foreign policy was very influenced by his Secretary of State, who was a man by the name of Henry Kissinger. And Kissinger was a believer in a school of politics known as Realpolitik, which is a German word that just means realistic politics. And the idea of Realpolitik is, move away from kind of the moralistic sense of foreign policy that led us into the early days of the Cold War, and the Truman Doctrine, and so where we felt the need to protect democracy across the world, and move toward just kind of keeping the world stable. And so, basically Kissinger was, in his school of thought, was a little more willing to just live with the fact that the Soviet Union is there, and just try to maintain enough peace and economic security for everyone to get by, even though you're going to have a lot of people, enslaved under communism. So, so he's a little bit less hawkish on confronting international communism than previous secretaries of state had been. So, so with that, part of this play for stability is the idea of arms limitations. This is something that at the time, it was kind of considered a little bit more of a liberal cause, because a lot of conservatives didn't really trust the Soviets to agree to a treaty, or thought it was dumb to limit your own ability to respond, but it actually did have a decent amount of conservative support too. Ronald Reagan actually, contrary to kind of the stereotype of Reagan, was actually a pretty big supporter of arms limitations. But the issue with arms limitations, if you're going to say, hey, let's put a cap on the amount of guns we're going to make here and the amount of missiles we're going to make here, you have to be able to trust that the other side is going to follow that. Because if you unilaterally disarm, meaning you give up armaments and the other side doesn't, you've put yourself at a severe security risk. And so a lot of people love the idea of arms limitation, but then there's another group of people that said this is nuts because we've seen the Soviet Union do horrible things for decades now. Why are we going to trust them to follow through and actually disarm when they say they're going to? And that was a very real question. Ultimately, they do wind up signing a SALT treaty, a strategic arms limitation treaty that limits the amount of warheads that each country could have. And then they're going to go back to the well a couple years later and try to start a second one to bring that number down a little bit more. But when Carter's president, but the problem with SALT II, the continuation of the policy dies because the Soviets invade Afghanistan, which kind of is a sign of their kind of returning to a more militaristic footing, and so the Soviets kind of shoot SALT II down before it happens by starting to act like starting to act like who they were again. So again, Nixon had this vision, has this image of he's this die-hard Cold Warrior, and his primary foreign policy accomplishment is an arms control treaty with the Soviet Union and establishing diplomatic relations with communist China. So not what you would have expected from the chairman of HUOC. So with that, the third kind of surprising thing there was his ending of the war in Vietnam. He famously, in '68, he ran on having a secret plan to end the war. And, of course, when they'd ask you what's the secret plan, he'd say, I can't tell you, it's a secret, which is kind of an odd campaign tactic, but it surprisingly worked. But ultimately, there's going to be an increase. As Nixon comes in, there's going to be an uptick in anti-war sentiment. When we last started talking about the anti-war movement, it was predominantly associated with like the New Left and the campus radicals and the hippies. But there's a handful of things that happen that begin to turn average America against the war as well. I mean, obviously, just the mass statistics of the draft is one of them. I mean, you just got so many people. If you know anyone who's between the ages of 60, 55 to 70, I guarantee you, if they didn't go to Vietnam, they know lots of people that got drafted. It's just that whole generation had that as a defining thing. There's a great old Bellamy Brothers song, a country group from the '80s that they called Old Hippie. It had a line about, I was sure back in the '60s that everyone was hip, but then they sent me off to Vietnam on my senior trip. So there's three major things, in addition to just the constant drafting and the numbers of deaths just ticking up every day. So it started to take their toll. There's a few key events that kind of turn public opinion against Vietnam. The first is the My Lai Massacre, which is when an American unit under the command of William Calley just actually massacres a town. And this, one of the issues that was going on in the Vietnam War was the Viet Cong, the South Vietnamese communists that supported unification with the North. They moved among the general population, and so you're fighting to protect that general population, and yet you never know, who's with the other side. And so in this case, there had been some Viet Cong sympathizers in the town, and they had just, some stuff went down. They got a little high strung, I guess, and started to just blame the whole town for some things that happened, and they just started going in and just killing civilians. I mean, just literally murdering them. Ultimately, Calley is going to get court-martialed they're going to kind of like downgrade it to where he winds up, spending a lot of time like on house arrest when you would expect him to have been in the brig for the rest of his life. But he's really the only one who is. The commander is really the only one that's brought to justice for it. So that was at least as far as being convicted of murder. That was a big thing. That was kind of a shock to the system because that's not what you really expect of American soldiers. The second thing is the Kent State demonstration. So Kent State is a college outside of Cleveland, Tennessee. Not Cleveland, Tennessee. Cleveland, Ohio. There is a Cleveland, Tennessee. They're outside of Cleveland, Ohio, and there was an anti-war protest. The Ohio governor was starting to get a little nervous that it could turn into a riot, so they called in the Ohio National Guard. Some people started to throw rocks at the guardsmen. A couple of the guardsmen panicked and opened fire, and they wound up killing 4 people, 2 protesters, and then 2 students who were just walking to class. They had nothing to do with it. They were just, walking across campus and got hit by strays or whatever. And so this was a big thing. Like, American soldiers just shot 4 protesters. And of course, I mean, you don't throw rocks at guys with guns. Just common sense, people. Don't throw rocks at people carrying guns. Because, whether they may have felt that they were under fire, nonetheless, that's kind of not a proportionate response. But you got, 2 protesters were killed. But then you had 2 people who had nothing to do with it who wound up getting hurt in the process. So that turns things against them. And the third thing is something known as the Pentagon Papers. So Daniel Ellsberg was a Pentagon official who became aware of how much the government had been cooking the books about Vietnam. We mentioned in a previous video that the American government was not really honest with the people about how the war in Vietnam was going, about what kind of casualties we were having, about what kind of success we were having securing areas. And so Ellsberg leaks a bunch of this material, much of which had been classified, leaks it to the New York Times. The government tries to keep the Times from running it. It winds up going all the way to the Supreme Court. But the information ultimately becomes public. And when it does, we find out that especially the Kennedy and Johnson administrations had really been hiding a lot of stuff from the American public. One thing that came out was that the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which is the law that Congress voted on that gave President Johnson the authority to step up the troop levels in Vietnam, had actually been written and drafted before the supposed Gulf of Tonkin incident, which is, if you remember, where we believe that an American ship had gotten fired on off the Gulf of Tonkin. That opened up the question of whether the whole Gulf of Tonkin incident was a fraud or not. And so that was a huge thing because that was the reason we went to war, to a great extent. So all of the combination of all these things is just the tide is starting to turn against Vietnam. And then we mentioned in the previous video about Vietnam the Tet Offensive and kind of the way that was in actuality inaccurately spun by the media as this huge setback, when in actuality it was a pretty big American victory, but that wasn't the way it was really perceived at the time. So all of this contributes to everyone kind of wanting to get out of Vietnam. There is there are some successes in Vietnam in the early 70s. There's people question the ethics of this, but there was a program called Operation Phoenix that tried to do targeted assassinations of North Vietnamese communist leaders. It actually had a little bit of success. Ultimately, though, Nixon and Kissinger are going to work really hard on the Paris peace talks, which were the attempted peace treaty with the North Vietnamese. Ultimately, they're going to come up with a plan that's called Vietnamitization, which was going to facilitate, well, this is what Nixon did as his plan when he got, Nixon's plan was what they called Vietnamitization, which was the idea of shifting more of the burden of the war away from American troops and toward South Vietnamese troops, and so trying to reorient the American effort toward like training the South Vietnamese army. Unfortunately, it didn't work out very well. The South Vietnamese army, for whatever reason, was just not very responsive to what we were trying to do as far as training and supply and so forth. So Vietnamization didn't really work out that well. And then in the Paris peace talks, they wound up negotiating a certain deal. When we leave, it is not long after we leave that the North Vietnamese, basically throw the peace treaty in the trash and go invade South Vietnam. And the treaty was structured in such a way that if the North, ignored it and reinvaded, that America would send troops back as well. The problem was, by the time that happened, Nixon had been replaced as president by Gerald Ford over the whole Watergate thing, which we'll talk about in the next video. And there was just no way. There was no way that there was political will in America to send troops back into Vietnam a second time after it had been, at that point in time, the longest war in American history. Then we got out for a couple years, had Watergate, the government lying to everybody. Ford comes in. The first thing he does is pardon Richard Nixon, which is extraordinarily controversial. We'll talk about all that next time. So ultimately, there's no way that we're going to help South Vietnam the second go round. And so there's this famous or infamous scene of the city of Saigon, which is the South Vietnamese capital, falling, and helicopters taking off of the U.S. embassy with ropes down where everybody that could possibly get onto a rope leaving in a U.S. chopper was trying to get on and escape with the American diplomats that were trying to leave. And so Saigon, the South Vietnamese capital, is now known as Ho Chi Minh City, which, again, not a good sign that the war is going well when your capital city is renamed after your opponent's leader. So Vietnam becomes the first clear-cut defeat in American history. We functionally lose the Vietnam War, where we do not achieve the goals that we had set out with, which was preventing a North Vietnamese conquest of the South. And losing Vietnam is a real losing Vietnam and the Watergate scandal at the same time, and then you've got all the domestic turbulence, some of it for good reasons, some of it for bad reasons. There was just a general kind of loss of confidence. And combined with that, the 70s also a time of a pretty bad economy in the 1970s. So the combination of all these things kind of leads to a moment of an American loss of confidence. If you read if you were to go back in time and read editorials from the mid-70s, I mean, you get this kind of sense of doom, of like, this is not the way things are supposed to be. And a little bit of defeatism in a lot of those sorts of editorials and things like that if you go back and read a lot of them. So, 60s and 70s, both kind of hard times for America in different ways. One thing that happens, one thing I've neglected to mention that I need to mention. Another thing that contributed to loss of support for Vietnam, and another thing that led to Nixon having some public relations issues and some distrust that helps cook his goose when the Watergate scandal comes. One of the tactics that the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were using to some success in the Vietnam War was escaping across the borders to other countries like Cambodia and Laos, knowing that American soldiers didn't have the authority to follow them there. They didn't have jurisdiction because we weren't at war with those countries. And in particular, they started escaping to Cambodia a lot. And the only way to kind of disrupt those supply lines and deal with those forces the way they were doing that was to invade Cambodia. Now, Nixon knew that there's no way that he could go to Congress and say, let's pass a law, granting me permission to send troops into Cambodia. It would not have passed with there being this much anti-war sentiment. So what Nixon does is he just does it anyway. He just secretly starts sending bombers and occasionally even troops into Cambodia, which is a country that was not a part of the war resolution, to conduct war on the Viet Cong. Now, militarily, it had to be done. Militarily, that was the right move. Like, if you're narrowly looking at what is the thing to do to defeat the Viet Cong, it's send troops into Cambodia. But it was kind of a terrifying thing to say, an American president just committed troops to a country we're not at war with without congressional permission and no one even knew about it. That's a problem. It's a bad precedent. And this is going to help lead to the War Powers Act of 1973, which is going to limit presidential power in deploying troops. For whatever reason, no one has thought to go back to what the Constitution actually says, which is to have the Congress declare war. We haven't done that since 1945. I'm a little at a loss as to how the Congress just rolled over and let that happen. But so anyway, so all of that is going on. So the Nixon years, you've got the inflation, you've got the new economic policy, you've got the busing, you've got the end of Vietnam. You've just got a lot of stuff happening. So 1972, Nixon runs for re-election, and his opponent is a Democratic senator from the Midwest by the name of George McGovern. Now, McGovern, here's an interesting thing. McGovern, okay, so 1968, the Democratic convention turns into riots, and that whole thing. Hubert Humphrey, the Democratic candidate, was pretty unpopular with lots of the rank-and-file Democrats. So they appointed Senator McGovern to start what they called the McGovern Commission, and the McGovern Commission was it's supposed to investigate potential changes to the rules of the presidential nomination process to become more inclusive of people's opinions and so on. And what McGovern does is basically creates the template for the modern primary election. Up until that time, they had primaries, but they were kind of like formal polling. You know, if someone was doing great in primaries, it was a sign that they were popular. But the party bosses ultimately did whatever they wanted to, and they actually settled on the nominee at the national convention. We've talked about this, but McGovern decides to change it to where, you know, when you win a state primary, that those delegates are actually pledged to vote for you, and the goal is to actually already have a nominee by the convention. It turned the convention from being a real place of decision making, to being essentially a TV infomercial. Not that there aren't real decisions made there about party rules and financial, stuff happens, but the National Convention becomes largely this made-for-TV infomercial where, the already anointed candidate gets, 3 days of publicity. But so McGovern creates the rules for the modern presidential primary and then wins it 4 years later. Takes advantage of the rules that he put in place to actually win the Democratic nomination. Basically, the Democratic race came down to a challenge between McGovern, who represented the more liberal wing, and George Wallace, who was once again running as a Democrat after having made an independent run in '68. Wallace, I don't think he probably could have won the nomination anyway, but he wound up having to abandon the campaign after getting shot and paralyzed. So, with that, McGovern gets the nomination, and McGovern is the most radically liberal nominee that the Democrats possibly have ever run. Maybe Obama was a little more liberal. They're about on the same playing field. But up until kind of the Bernie era, no one had really gotten to the left of McGovern. Basically, wanted a great deepening of governmental control over economic matters. And he was just considered to be, beyond the pale for a lot of average Americans. And Nixon wins a landslide. I mean, Nixon crushes McGovern. As bad as Lyndon Johnson had crushed Goldwater in '64, 8 years later, McGovern was getting crushed by Nixon the same way. And that sent a message to the leadership of both the Republican and Democratic parties. Within an 8-year period, you have, the extreme conservative Goldwater, the extreme liberal in McGovern both getting slaughtered. And this, has led the establishments of those political parties to kind of favor moderates ever since, although sometimes, you'll have a conservative breakthrough like Reagan or at the time Obama was considered in the liberal wing of the Democrats, although he would be the centrist guy if he was running again today, which is terrifying. Because he was pretty liberal. So anyway, Nixon wins re-election, going away. I think he wins like 46 of the 50 states, something like that. And you would think that to win re-election that much of a landslide, that you're going to walk into a smoother second term, and and you're going to finish your presidency being considered a popular president or a really good president. But that's not the way things go, and a lot of that is because Nixon. Part of how he got to where he got was he loved to play hardball, and he loved to do campaign dirty tricks and all that kind of stuff, and it's going to come back to bite him and cost him his presidency and his legacy. And we're going to talk about that tomorrow. So y'all have yourselves a good day.